Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city so powerful that the greatest empire in history feared it, hated it, and finally erased it from the earth. Not defeated, erased. Its temples torn down, its harbors filled, its streets burned, its very name cursed in the Senate of Rome. And yet, for centuries before its destruction, this city ruled the western Mediterranean. Its ships crossed oceans, its merchants grew unimaginably wealthy, its generals terrified Rome, its engineers built one of the most sophisticated harbors in the ancient world, and today most people barely remember it. This was Carthage. Long before Rome became an empire, before Julius Caesar, before Augustus, there was another power rising on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. At dawn, the sea along the North African coast is calm. The water reflects soft pink light as the sun climbs slowly above the horizon. Fishing boats drift quietly. The scent of salt and cedar hangs in the air. 2,500 years ago, this same coastline would have revealed something extraordinary: massive stone walls, watchtowers facing the sea, and beyond them, a harbor unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Not a simple port, but a perfectly engineered naval complex, a vast outer harbor for trade ships arriving from Spain, Sicily, and beyond. And behind it, hidden and circular, a military harbor designed for war. Hundreds of warships could be docked there, each with its own slip, each ready to launch within minutes. From above, the inner harbor formed a perfect ring. In its center stood an island headquarters where admirals could oversee the fleet. It was not chaotic, it was not improvised, it was precise. Carthage was built for the sea, but Carthage did not begin as an empire. It began with exile. Sometime in the 9th century BCE, ships left the Phoenician city of Tyre in the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were traders, masters of navigation, shipbuilding, and commerce. They did not conquer vast lands the way later empires would. Instead, they stitched the Mediterranean together with ports and contracts. One ship carried a woman. Her name, according to later tradition, was Alyssa. The Romans would call her Dido. She was said to be a princess, fleeing political violence in her homeland. Her brother had seized power. Her husband was dead. And so she gathered followers, wealth, and sailed westward into uncertainty. When her fleet reached the North African coast, she negotiated with local tribes for land. The legend says she was offered only as much territory as could be covered by an ox hide, so she cut the ox hide into thin strips and enclosed an entire hill. Whether this story is myth or metaphor, it tells us something essential. Carthage was born from intelligence, negotiation, and survival. The hill, she claimed, would become the Bursa, the heart of the city. From there, Carthage grew, not recklessly, strategically. The Phoenicians had already established trading posts across the Mediterranean, in Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, and southern Spain. But Carthage occupied a unique position. It stood at the crossroads between east and west. Ships traveling between the Levant and Iberia passed nearby. Trade routes between Africa and Europe converged at its shores, and Carthage took advantage. Timber from North Africa fed shipyards, silver from Spain filled treasuries, grain flowed from fertile hinterlands. Purple dye, the luxury pigment of royalty, moved through its markets. Ivory, gold, ceramics, fine textiles, all passed through its docks. Unlike Rome, Carthage did not depend on conquering neighboring farmland for survival. It depended on movement, on wind, on water, on relationships. Its merchants were bold. Some ancient sources describe Carthaginian expeditions sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic Ocean. One expedition, led by a man named Hanno, reportedly sailed down the west coast of Africa. His account survives only in fragments, but it speaks of unfamiliar landscapes, strange wildlife, and distant horizons. Carthage was not afraid of distance, and distance brought wealth. As the centuries passed, the city expanded across the western Mediterranean. When its Phoenician mother city Tyre declined under pressure from Eastern empires, Carthage inherited leadership of the western colonies. It extended influence across North Africa, it secured Sardinia, it contested Sicily, it pushed into Iberia. But Carthage did not always conquer by force. Often it negotiated, it formed alliances, it established trade monopolies. Its government reflected this commercial mindset. Carthage was not ruled by kings. It was governed by elected magistrates known as suffet. There was a powerful council of elders, assemblies of citizens, generals who commanded armies but did not necessarily dominate politics. It was, in many ways, a republic, but it was not Rome. Where Rome built its power through disciplined citizen armies, Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries, Iberian warriors, Numidian cavalry, Libyan infantry, Gauls from distant regions. Its citizens preferred commerce and naval command to grinding infantry warfare. This would later shape its fate. Religion, too, played a central role in Carthaginian life. They worshipped gods inherited from Phoenician tradition, Baal, Hammon, and Tanit among them. Temples stood within the city. Rituals were observed. Offerings were made. Roman writers later accused Carthage of horrific child sacrifice. Archaeological discoveries of burial urns have fueled centuries of debate. Some scholars believe sacrifices occurred in times of extreme crisis, and others argue that the evidence reflects ordinary child mortality and ritual burial practices misinterpreted by enemies. We must remember, almost everything we know about Carthage was recorded by Rome, and Rome hated Carthage. For by the 3rd century BCE, two powers stood across the Mediterranean from one another, one in North Africa, one in central Italy, both ambitious, both expanding, both certain of their destiny. Carthage commanded the sea, Rome commanded land. For a time they coexisted, but the Mediterranean is not large enough for two superpowers, and when they collided, the wars that followed would be so brutal, so transformative, that Carthage would never recover. Its name would be spoken with fear. Its greatest general would march across the Alps with elephants, and its final destruction would become one of the most complete erasures in ancient history. Yet tonight, before war arrives, before fire and siege and vengeance, we remain in the early light. We stand on the Bursa hill, we look out over a rising city of ships and stone, we watch a forgotten empire take shape, and we begin the slow journey into the story of Carthage. The sea did not bring peace for long. Carthage had grown rich on trade, but wealth has a way of attracting rivalry. Across the narrow waters of the central Mediterranean, another civilization had been expanding westward for generations: the Greeks. Long before Rome became a threat, Carthage's greatest competition came from Greek colonies scattered across Sicily and southern Italy. These were not minor settlements. Cities like Syracuse, Agrigentum, and Gela were powerful, cultured, and ambitious. They controlled fertile land and commanded strategic harbors. And Sicily, that triangular island at the heart of the Mediterranean, lay directly between Carthage's African homeland and its western trade routes. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled movement. And so, slowly, tension grew. In the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Carthage and the Greek cities collided repeatedly, sometimes through diplomacy, often through war. The conflicts were not brief skirmishes, but grinding campaigns across fields and fortified cities. One of the earliest major clashes came in 480 BCE, the same year the Greeks on the mainland were fighting Persia at Thermopylae and Salamis. While Leonidas and Themistocles defended Greece from the east, Carthage launched a massive expedition against Sicily from the west. Then the Carthaginian general Hamilcar, not the later Hamilcar Barca, but an earlier namesake, led what ancient sources claim was an enormous force across the sea. Thousands of troops, warships, supplies enough for a long campaign. But at the Battle of Himera, the Carthaginian army was decisively defeated by the forces of Syracuse and its allies. The loss was devastating. Hamilcar himself died. Whether in battle or ritual suicide, accounts differ. The army was shattered, and for decades afterward, Carthage retreated from aggressive expansion in Sicily. It was a rare moment of restraint. Instead of immediate revenge, Carthage turned inward. It strengthened its political institutions. It reinforced its navy. It expanded commercial networks elsewhere. Sardinia and North Africa became more firmly integrated into its sphere. Trade continued to flourish. Carthage did not collapse after Himera. It adapted. This resilience would define the city for centuries. When Carthage returned to Sicily in the late 5th century BCE, it did so methodically. Generals like Hannibal Mago and later Himilco launched renewed campaigns. Cities were besieged, alliances shifted, entire populations were displaced. Sicily became a chessboard of fortresses and counter-fortresses, and yet, despite repeated offensives, Carthage never fully conquered the island. Nor did the Greeks ever expel Carthage completely. Instead, Sicily remained divided. Western regions largely under Carthaginian control, eastern territories dominated by powerful Greek cities like Syracuse. It was an uneasy balance. Meanwhile, Carthage continued strengthening its hold over Iberia, modern Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was rich in silver mines, fertile lands, and fierce warrior tribes. For Carthage, Iberia was both a resource base and a recruiting ground. Silver-funded fleets, warriors filled mercenary ranks. Trade routes extended deeper into the Atlantic. Carthage was becoming not merely a wealthy city, but a regional superpower. Its navy was the backbone of its strength. Carthaginian shipbuilders perfected the quincireme, a powerful warship with multiple banks of oars, capable of speed and ramming force. Their sailors trained rigorously. Harbors were organized with efficiency that astonished later observers. In contrast, Rome at this time was still consolidating control over central Italy. For centuries, Rome had been fighting land wars against Etruscans, Samnites, and neighboring Latin tribes. It was disciplined, undetermined, relentless. But Rome had almost no navy. Its strength lay in citizen infantry, heavily armed, tightly organized, adaptable in battle. Two different civilizations were evolving in parallel. One mastered the sea, the other mastered land warfare. For a time, their spheres of influence did not collide directly. Carthage looked west and south. Rome expanded north and south across the Italian peninsula. But geography has a way of narrowing options. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had defeated most of its Italian rivals. It had absorbed Latin cities, subdued the Samnites, and even confronted Greek forces in southern Italy under King Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus famously defeated Rome in battle, but at such heavy cost that his victories became synonymous with ruin. "Another such victory," he reportedly said, "and we are undone." Rome survived. It always seemed to survive. When Pyrrhus withdrew from Italy in 275 BCE, Rome stood stronger than before. Its legions were battle-hardened, its confidence grew, and suddenly Rome faced outward. Across a narrow strait lay Sicily, divided between Greek cities and Carthaginian influence. Messina, a city at the northeastern tip of the island, became the spark. In 264 BCE, a group of mercenaries known as the Mamertines seized control of Messina. When they found themselves threatened by Syracuse, they sought help, first from Carthage. Carthage responded quickly, sending a garrison to protect its interests. But the Mamertines, uneasy under Carthaginian oversight, also appealed to Rome. Rome hesitated. Intervening would mean crossing into territory long dominated by Carthage. It would mean naval conflict. It would mean challenging the most powerful maritime state in the western Mediterranean. But Rome had changed. Its confidence had grown with each conquest in Italy. The Senate debated, and finally Rome chose intervention. Roman troops crossed into Sicily. Carthage refused to withdraw, and in that moment, almost quietly, one of the most consequential rivalries in ancient history began: the First Punic War. The word Punic comes from the Latin poeni, Rome's term for the Carthaginians, derived from Phoenician. This would not be a short conflict. It would last 23 years. It would reshape naval warfare. It would bankrupt treasuries. It would test endurance more than brilliance. And it would transform Rome from a land power into a naval empire. For Carthage, it would be the first true existential struggle. The Mediterranean that once felt open and profitable was becoming contested. The sea, once a highway of commerce, was becoming a battlefield. Ships that had carried grain and silver would now carry soldiers and siege engines. Harbors that had sheltered merchants would launch fleets for war. The forgotten city of Carthage was about to face an enemy unlike any it had known before, an enemy that did not retreat after defeat, an enemy that rebuilt fleets from wreckage, an enemy that would fight not for trade routes, but for supremacy. And as the waves rolled between Africa and Sicily, the balance of the ancient world began to tilt. If you're ready, we move next into the First Punic War, the long naval struggle that changed both civilizations forever. When war finally came between Rome and Carthage, it did not arrive in a single dramatic clash. It unfolded slowly, uneasily, almost awkwardly. Rome had spent centuries fighting on land. Its strength was the disciplined infantry legion, heavily armed citizen soldiers advancing in tight formations. Carthage, by contrast, commanded the sea. Its navy had protected trade routes for generations. Its sailors were experienced. Its admirals were confident. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE over Sicily, but very quickly it became something larger. It became a test of endurance. At first, Carthage held the advantage. Its fleets could move troops and supplies freely across the water. Roman forces on Sicily found themselves outmaneuvered by sea power they could not match. Rome faced a dilemma. It could not win the war without confronting Carthage at sea. But Rome had no real navy, so it did something astonishing. It built one. According to later Roman historians, the Republic captured a Carthaginian quinquereme, a powerful warship, and used it as a template. Roman shipbuilders, unfamiliar with advanced naval design, worked quickly. Forests in Italy were cut down, shipyards expanded, thousands of rowers were trained from scratch. It was a massive gamble. Within months, Rome had assembled a fleet of more than 100 warships. They were inexperienced, their sailors were untested, but Rome had an idea. If it could not outsail Carthage, it would outfight it. The Romans invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with a heavy spike. When Roman ships closed with Carthaginian vessels, the corvus would drop, locking the two ships together. Roman infantry could then board and turn a naval engagement into something familiar, a land battle fought on wooden decks. It was an adaptation born of necessity, and it worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the Roman fleet, commanded by Gaius Duilius, achieved its first major naval victory. Carthaginian ships, expecting superior maneuverability to prevail, suddenly found themselves grappled and boarded by Roman soldiers. The sea had become a battlefield for legionaries. For Carthage, the shock was significant. The city had long assumed naval superiority was secure, but Rome did not fight by established rules. It transformed its weakness into something unpredictable. The war dragged on. Sicily became a landscape of sieges and counter-sieges. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Supply lines were attacked. Storms wrecked fleets on both sides. Entire armadas were lost to the Mediterranean's unforgiving weather. The sea was as dangerous as the enemy. In 256 BCE, Rome attempted something bold. A massive fleet transported a Roman army across the Mediterranean to North Africa itself. For the first time, war threatened Carthage's homeland. Roman forces landed successfully and advanced inland, defeating Carthaginian troops in open battle. Carthage, facing crisis, turned to a Spartan mercenary commander named Xanthippus. He reorganized Carthage's army. He emphasized cavalry and war elephants, assets that Rome struggled to counter in open terrain. At the Battle of the Bagradus River, Roman forces were crushed. The invasion failed. Survivors retreated toward the coast. A rescue fleet was dispatched from Rome, only to be devastated by a violent storm. Thousands of sailors drowned, ships shattered against rocks. The cost was staggering, and yet neither side surrendered. The First Punic War did not produce quick, decisive moments. It produced attrition. Carthage relied heavily on mercenary forces in Sicily, Iberians, Gauls, Africans. These troops fought effectively, but they required payment. War strained Carthage's finances. Rome, by contrast, mobilized citizen manpower on a scale Carthage struggled to match. Its losses were enormous, but its political structure allowed repeated levies of soldiers and rowers. Years passed. Fleet after fleet was built and destroyed. Finally, in 241 BCE, after more than 2 decades of struggle, Rome assembled yet another fleet, financed in part by wealthy citizens who loaned money to the state. The Roman commander Gaius Lutatius Catulus met the Carthaginian fleet near the Aegates Islands off western Sicily. This time, Rome prevailed decisively. Carthage, exhausted and financially drained, sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage would abandon Sicily. It would pay heavy indemnities. It would withdraw its forces. For the first time, Rome had defeated Carthage. For the first time, Rome had acquired territory outside the Italian peninsula. And something fundamental shifted. Rome was no longer merely an Italian power. It was a Mediterranean power. For Carthage, the defeat was humiliating, but not fatal. The city still possessed wealth. It still commanded trade networks. It still controlled North Africa and parts of Iberia, but the strain of the war soon produced a crisis from within. When Carthage attempted to demobilize its mercenary armies after the war, it struggled to pay them. Promised wages were delayed. Negotiations broke down. The result was brutal. The Mercenary War, also known as the Truceless War, erupted in 240 BCE. Former Carthaginian mercenaries revolted. African subjects joined them. Cities rebelled. The conflict was savage. No quarter was given. Prisoners were tortured. Executions were carried out on both sides. Carthage nearly collapsed under the weight of internal rebellion. It was saved by one man, Hamilcar Barca. He was a seasoned general who had fought in Sicily during the First Punic War. Resourceful, charismatic, unrelentless, Hamilcar led Carthaginian forces against the rebels with ruthless efficiency. Over several years, he crushed the revolt. Carthage survived, barely, but survival came with scars. While Carthage was consumed by civil war, Rome took advantage of the situation. It seized Sardinia and Corsica, territories Carthage had previously controlled. The loss deepened resentment. Within Carthage, a new generation began to rise. They understood something that previous leaders had not fully grasped. Rome was no longer a distant competitor. Rome was an existential threat. Hamilcar Barca turned his attention westward, to Iberia. If Carthage could not regain Sicily immediately, it could rebuild strength elsewhere. Iberia was rich in silver. It offered manpower and resources. And Hamilcar had another reason. He had a son, a young boy who would grow up hearing stories of Roman betrayal, of humiliation, of lost territory, a boy who would swear an oath of eternal hostility toward Rome. His name was Hannibal, and as Carthage rebuilt its fortunes in Iberia, as silver flowed once more into its treasury, as new armies were trained and equipped, the uneasy peace between Rome and Carthage began to fray. The First Punic War had ended, but it had not resolved the rivalry. It had only prepared the ground for something far greater, something far more dangerous. If you're ready, next we move into Iberia, the rise of the Barcid family, and the path toward the most famous campaign in ancient history. After the long exhaustion of the First Punic War and the terror of the mercenary revolt, Carthage did not collapse. It recalibrated. There are moments in history when a defeated power fades quietly into irrelevance. Carthage did not choose that path. Instead, it turned westward, toward Iberia, with deliberate purpose. Hamilcar Barca understood something that many in Carthage's ruling council only partially accepted. If Rome was to be confronted again, Carthage would need money, manpower, and momentum. Iberia offered all three. The Iberian Peninsula was not an empty frontier. It was home to diverse tribes, Celtiberians, Turdetani, Lusitanians, each with their own leaders, loyalties, and rivalries. The land was rich in silver mines, especially near what is now southern Spain. Its hills and river valleys could support agriculture and settlement, and its warriors were fierce, proud, and accustomed to conflict. In 237 BCE, the Hamilcar sailed for Iberia with his young son. Some ancient accounts tell us that before departing, Hamilcar brought the boy Hannibal to an altar and made him swear an oath never to be a friend of Rome. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, it reflects the atmosphere of the time. Rome's seizure of Sardinia during Carthage's internal crisis had left deep bitterness. Trust between the two powers was thin. In Iberia, Hamilcar did not simply establish trading posts. He built something closer to a personal dominion. Through a mixture of diplomacy and force, he forged alliances with local tribes. He defeated rivals in battle. He expanded Carthaginian influence inland. Silver began flowing again, not just into Carthage's treasury, but into the hands of the Barcid family. Hamilcar's power grew, and so did Carthage's resources. After nearly a decade of campaigning, Hamilcar died in battle, reportedly while fighting Iberian tribes near the river Jucar. Leadership passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal was less aggressive than Hamilcar, but no less strategic. He consolidated control. He founded a new city, Carthage, meaning new city. The Romans would later call it Carthago Nova. From this stronghold on the southeastern coast of Iberia, Carthage now had a secure base, complete with harbor, fortifications, and access to the rich silver mines nearby. It was more than a colony. It was a capital in waiting. Hasdrubal also negotiated a treaty with Rome. The Ebro Treaty, agreed around 226 BCE, established the Ebro River as a boundary. Carthage would not expand north of it. Rome would not interfere south of it. It was a temporary arrangement, one that allowed both powers to pause. But there was an exception: the city of Saguntum. Saguntum lay south of the Ebro River, technically within Carthaginian influence, but it had established friendly relations with Rome. It was a small detail. Small details in history often become the turning point. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, leadership passed to Hamilcar's son, now in his mid-20s, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal had grown up in Iberia. He had ridden with cavalry. He had learned languages of allied tribes. He understood both diplomacy and warfare. He was bold, intelligent, and charismatic. Under his command, Carthaginian power in Iberia expanded rapidly. Rome watched carefully. In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. The siege lasted months. Saguntum appealed to Rome for assistance. Rome protested. Hannibal continued the assault. When Saguntum finally fell, Rome demanded that Carthage surrender Hannibal. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun, but this war would not resemble the first. Hannibal understood something radical. Carthage could not defeat Rome by fighting another drawn-out naval war. Rome's manpower reserves were too deep, its political will too stubborn. Instead, Hannibal chose audacity. He would not wait for Rome to invade Africa. He would invade Italy. In 218 BCE, Hannibal began one of the most astonishing military marches in ancient history. He left Iberia with tens of thousands of troops, infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees. He traversed southern Gaul. He reached the Rhone River. And then he faced the Alps. The Alps were not simply mountains. They were vast, cold, hostile barriers, snow-covered passes, narrow cliffs, ambush-prone valleys. Ancient sources describe brutal conditions: snowstorms, treacherous descents, local tribes attacking from above, men slipping into ravines, elephants struggling along icy paths. Hannibal lost many soldiers during the crossing, but he did not turn back. When he descended into northern Italy, he had achieved something extraordinary. Rome had not expected him. Roman armies had prepared to confront Carthage in Spain or Africa. Instead, an enemy army now stood on Italian soil. The shock reverberated through the Republic. Hannibal moved quickly. At the Battle of the Trebia River in 218 BCE, he lured Roman forces into cold waters and ambushed them. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in military history, trapping Roman legions between the lake and surrounding hills. The Roman army was annihilated. Panic spread. Rome appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius understood that direct confrontation with Hannibal's army was dangerous. Instead of seeking decisive battle, he shadowed Hannibal, cutting off supplies, avoiding pitched engagements. It was a strategy of delay. Many Romans found it frustrating. They wanted victory. They wanted decisive action. In 216 BCE, Rome abandoned caution. It assembled one of the largest armies it had ever fielded, perhaps 70,000 or more soldiers, and marched to confront Hannibal near the small town of Cannae in southern Italy. The Battle of Cannae became legendary. Hannibal deliberately weakened his center, drawing Roman forces inward. As the Romans pushed forward, Carthaginian and allied troops on the flanks encircled them. The Roman army was surrounded, compressed, slaughtered. Ancient estimates of casualties vary, but tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died that day. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire noble families were wiped out. Consuls were killed. The Senate mourned in silence. Yet Rome did not surrender. That, perhaps, is the most astonishing part. After Cannae, several Italian cities defected to Hannibal. Capua joined him. Some southern regions shifted allegiance, but Rome held firm. It refused negotiations, it raised new legions, it avoided large battles, it harassed Hannibal's supply lines. Hannibal marched across Italy for years, victorious in battle, and yet unable to force Rome to collapse. Carthage, meanwhile, did not fully reinforce him. The reasons remain debated. Political divisions within Carthage, logistical challenges, overconfidence in Hannibal's ability to sustain himself. Whatever the cause, Hannibal remained in Italy without decisive support. Rome adapted. It attacked Carthaginian holdings in Spain. A young Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, rose to prominence. He captured Carthago Nova in 209 BCE, cutting off Carthage's silver supply. He defeated Carthaginian forces at the Battle of Ilipa. Gradually, Rome stripped Carthage of Iberia. The war that had begun with Hannibal's daring invasion now began to turn. Scipio proposed something bold. Instead of chasing Hannibal endlessly across Italy, Rome would invade Africa, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general. In 204 BCE, Roman forces landed in North Africa. The homeland of Carthage was threatened for the first time since the First Punic War. Hannibal was recalled from Italy after nearly 15 years of campaigning. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal faced Scipio. The two great commanders met in open battle. Hannibal's elephants were neutralized, his troops outmaneuvered. Carthage was defeated. The Second Punic War ended with harsher terms than before. Carthage lost its overseas territories, it surrendered its fleet. It agreed to massive indemnities. It promised not to wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal went into exile. Carthage remained standing, but it was no longer an equal power. And yet, even in defeat, Carthage did not disappear. It rebuilt its economy. It paid its debts. Its markets revived. Its farms flourished. In some ways, it recovered faster than Rome expected. And in Rome, a dangerous idea began to take hold. Carthage, even weakened, was still prosperous. And some Roman senators believed prosperity itself was a threat. One of them would end every speech, regardless of topic, with the same words, "Carthage must be destroyed." If you're ready, next we move into the final chapter, the uneasy peace, the fear in Rome, and the Third Punic War that erased a civilization. After Zama, silence settled over Carthage, but it was not the silence of extinction. It was the silence of endurance. The treaty imposed by Rome in 201 BCE was severe. Carthage surrendered its navy, reduced to a handful of ships. It agreed to pay a massive indemnity over 50 years. It relinquished Iberia. It promised not to wage war without Roman approval. On paper, Carthage was broken. In reality, it adapted once more. Without a navy to maintain, resources shifted inward. Agriculture flourished in the fertile lands surrounding the city. Carthaginian farmers were renowned even by Roman writers for their skill. The agronomist Mago of Carthage had composed a vast agricultural treatise, so respected that after Carthage's destruction, Rome ordered it translated into Latin. Trade resumed, more cautiously, more quietly, but effectively. Carthage remained strategically located. Its merchants still understood Mediterranean commerce better than most. Within a generation, the indemnity to Rome was paid off. ahead of schedule, and that success caused anxiety in Rome. Rome had expected Carthage to remain crippled for decades. Instead, Carthage was prosperous again, not militarily powerful, but economically resilient. Meanwhile, Rome had expanded dramatically. It defeated Macedon. It extended influence into Greece. It intervened in Asia Minor. The Republic was becoming an imperial power in all but name. Yet Carthage lingered in Roman imagination like an unfinished threat. One Roman statesman embodied this fear: Cato the Elder. Cato had visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and was reportedly struck by how quickly the city had recovered. Upon returning to Rome, he began ending every speech in the Senate, no matter the subject, with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It did not matter if the discussion concerned roads, taxation, or provincial governance. Cato would conclude with that warning. To him and others, Carthage's mere existence was intolerable. Tension escalated over a smaller regional conflict. Numidia, a North African kingdom allied with Rome, frequently encroached on Carthaginian territory. Disputes over land and borders became increasingly aggressive. Carthage, bound by treaty not to wage war without Roman approval, repeatedly appealed to Rome for arbitration. Rome delayed, or sided with Numidia. Finally, in 151 BCE, Carthage acted without permission. It raised an army and confronted Numidian forces. Rome seized the opportunity. It declared that Carthage had violated the treaty. In 149 BCE, Roman armies landed in North Africa. The Third Punic War had begun. Unlike the previous wars, this one was not fought over distant territories. It was fought at Carthage itself. When Roman envoys arrived before hostilities began, they presented escalating demands. First, Carthage was to surrender hostages. Then, it was to hand over its weapons. Carthage complied, perhaps hoping to avoid total war. Thousands of suits of armor, hundreds of catapults, tens of thousands of shields and spears were delivered. Then came the final demand. The Roman envoys declared that the people of Carthage must abandon their city and relocate inland, that Carthage itself was to be destroyed. The citizens refused. For the first time in generations, Carthage prepared for desperate defense. With weapons surrendered, they began manufacturing new ones from scratch. Temples were stripped for metal. Women cut their hair to make rope for siege engines. Day and night, workshops produced arms. The city that had once dominated the Mediterranean Sea now fortified itself for survival. The siege began. Roman forces surrounded Carthage but initially struggled. The city's walls were massive. Its defenders fought fiercely. Urban warfare favored those who knew the streets. Years passed. Command eventually fell to a young Roman general, Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of the Scipio who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. In 146 BCE, after tightening the blockade and cutting off supplies, Roman forces finally breached the city. The fighting that followed was brutal, street by street, house by house, block by block. Ancient accounts describe 6 days of relentless combat within the city. Fires spread, buildings collapsed. Survivors retreated to the Byrsa Hill, the very hill that legend said Dido had once claimed with an ox hide. There, in the final stronghold, resistance collapsed. Carthage fell. The city was burned. Its population, those who survived, were enslaved. Temples were destroyed, walls dismantled, harbors ruined. Later Roman legend claimed that the land was salted so nothing would grow there, though modern historians doubt this detail. But symbolically the intent was clear. Rome did not merely defeat Carthage, it erased it. Scipio Aemilianus is said to have wept as he watched the city burn, reflecting that someday Rome itself might face similar destruction. Whether apocryphal or not, the image is haunting. The greatest rival of the Republic was gone. The Western Mediterranean belonged to Rome. Carthage, the maritime superpower, the trading empire, the city of engineers and merchants and generals, became rubble. For centuries afterward, Rome would dominate the Mediterranean world, and yet the story did not end entirely in ashes. In time, Rome rebuilt a new city on the same site. Roman Carthage rose from the ruins, prosperous, important, even magnificent. But it was no longer Phoenician, no longer independent, no longer the city that once terrified Rome. The original Carthage, the one founded by settlers from Tyre, expanded by Hamilcar, defended by Hannibal, lived only in memory, and much of that memory was preserved by its conquerors. Today, when we look at the remains near modern Tunis, fragments of walls, foundations of harbors, scattered stones, it is difficult to imagine what once stood there. A city of hundreds of thousands, a naval empire, a rival to Rome, forgotten not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant to be allowed to survive. And so the story of Carthage becomes more than a tale of war. It becomes a meditation on rivalry, on resilience, on adaptation, on the cost of fear. Carthage did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it stood in the path of Rome's ambition, and in the end, there was room for only one master of the Mediterranean. The sea that once carried Carthaginian ships now carried Roman ones. The harbors that once launched quinqueremes now lay silent. But if you listen carefully, beyond the noise of history's victors, you can still imagine the sound of oars cutting through early morning water, and a city that once ruled the sea. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE is often where the story ends. Flames, smoke, silence. But if we move too quickly to that ending, we miss something essential, because for nearly 600 years before that final fire, Carthage was not merely a rival to Rome, it was a living, breathing civilization. A city of markets and workshops, of fishermen and shipwrights, of priests and magistrates, of children running through sunlit courtyards, of merchants calculating profit beneath shaded porticos. To understand what was lost, we must step back again, not to war, but to life. Imagine Carthage at its height in the 3rd century BCE. The morning sun rises over the Gulf of Tunis. Light touches the whitewashed walls of houses clustered along the Byrsa Hill. The air carries the scent of bread baking in clay ovens. From the harbor, the rhythmic sound of oars echoes as ships depart at dawn. The outer harbor is busy already. Merchant vessels from Iberia unload amphorae filled with wine and olive oil. Others bring ingots of silver from the mines near Carthago Nova. Ships from Sardinia arrive with grain. African traders bring livestock and hides from inland regions. Dock workers move efficiently. Contracts are negotiated in multiple languages: Punic, Libyan dialects, Greek. Carthage was cosmopolitan. It was not culturally isolated. Phoenician at its core, yes, but influenced by Africa, by Iberia, by Sicily, by the broader Mediterranean. Its architecture reflected this blend. Houses were built around central courtyards. White plastered walls kept interiors cool. Rooftops were flat. Streets were narrow but organized, climbing the hill in planned tiers. At the top stood temples. The Temple of Eshmun, sanctuaries dedicated to Tanit, altars where incense rose in slow spirals toward the sky. Religion in Carthage was not theatrical. It was woven into daily life. Offerings were made quietly. Rituals followed established rhythms. Priests maintained sacred traditions passed down from Phoenician ancestors. Much debate surrounds the Tophet, a sacred precinct where urns containing cremated remains of infants have been discovered. Roman writers described horrific sacrificial rites. Modern scholars argue over interpretation. What is certain is that Carthage practiced rituals unfamiliar to Rome, and Rome, as conqueror, had incentive to portray its enemy as barbaric. History requires caution. As we walk through the imagined streets of Carthage, we must resist viewing them only through Roman accusation. Instead, picture craftsmen shaping bronze tools, weavers working dyed wool, children learning trade skills from their parents. Education in Carthage likely focused less on rhetoric than in Rome, and more on commerce and navigation. Knowledge of winds, tides, star positions, these were essential. The sea defined identity. In the circular military harbor, the Kothon, naval organization was astonishingly advanced. Each ship docked in its own covered slipway. Repair stations lined the perimeter. Storage rooms held rigging, sails, and oars. At the center island stood administrative buildings, perhaps offices where fleet readiness was monitored, perhaps shrines where blessings were requested before departure. This harbor was not accidental innovation. It represented generations of accumulated maritime knowledge, and beyond the harbor, stretching into fertile plains, lay agricultural estates. Roman writers later admired Carthaginian farming techniques. The treatise of Mago reportedly contained detailed instructions on vineyard cultivation, livestock management, irrigation systems. Agriculture sustained the city's population and its armies. Carthage was not merely a naval power, it was an agricultural society as well. Its population at peak may have reached 200,000 or more. That number is debated, but even conservative estimates place it among the largest cities of its time. And yet, despite wealth, despite engineering, despite trade dominance, Carthage never built the kind of cultural mythos that Rome mastered. Rome told stories of destiny, of wolves and twins, of divine favor, of eternal greatness. Carthage built quietly. It traded. It negotiated. It calculated. Perhaps that difference mattered. When war came, Rome mobilized ideology as well as legions. Carthage mobilized resources. After the Second Punic War, Carthage returned to this quieter identity. Its navy gone, it leaned even more heavily into commerce and agriculture. Markets flourished again. Indemnities were paid. Workshops reopened. And in this recovery lay the seed of its final destruction. Because Rome did not fear Carthage's armies, it feared its resilience. To Roman senators like Cato, Carthage's ability to rebound after catastrophe was intolerable. A defeated enemy that grows prosperous is more dangerous than one that remains weak. And so the slow drumbeat toward annihilation continued. But as we move forward toward that final siege, we must not rush. Instead, let us linger once more in the ordinary rhythms of the city. Imagine evening descending over Carthage. The sun sinks behind the western horizon, casting gold light across the sea. Ships return to harbor. Voices soften. Lamps are lit inside courtyard homes. In the distance, beyond the fields, desert winds stir the grasses. No one in those quiet moments knows what centuries will bring. No one senses that Rome will someday decide that this entire world must vanish. For now, Carthage lives, breathes, trades, prays, builds, and prepares, though it does not yet know it, for the final confrontation that will determine whether two civilizations can share the Mediterranean, or whether only one will remain. If we are to understand why Carthage ultimately fell, we must step inside its political heart. Not the battlefield, not the harbor, but the council chamber. Carthage was not ruled by a king in its mature form. It did not crown a single monarch whose word was absolute. Instead, it developed a complex political structure that, to outside observers, seemed both sophisticated and opaque. At the top were two chief magistrates known as the suffets. The word itself comes from the Phoenician term for judges. They were elected annually and presided over civic administration. In some ways, they resembled Roman consuls, but without the same automatic military command. Their power was significant but not unlimited. Behind them stood the Council of Elders, an aristocratic body composed of influential families, wealthy merchants, and experienced statesmen. It was here, within these stone chambers, that the long-term direction of Carthage was debated. Trade agreements, military funding, diplomatic responses. These decisions were not made impulsively. Carthage was governed by deliberation. The city's elite were deeply invested in commerce. Wealth flowed not from conquered farmland alone, but from maritime networks. Stability mattered. Predictability mattered. War, unless profitable or unavoidable, disrupted business. This political temperament would shape Carthage's response to Rome again and again, and sometimes it would divide the city. By the time of Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal, Carthage's leadership had begun to fracture into informal factions. One faction, often associated with the Barcid family, favored aggressive expansion, particularly in Iberia. They saw opportunity in bold action. They believed Rome's growing power must be checked before it became overwhelming. Another faction, sometimes described as more conservative or mercantile, preferred stability. They were cautious about provoking Rome. They had seen the cost of the First Punic War. They understood how fragile Carthage had nearly become during the mercenary revolt. Hannibal's rise to command in Iberia did not occur in a vacuum. He inherited not only his father's ambition, but also the political tensions of his homeland. While Hannibal campaigned across Italy, winning stunning victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, Carthage itself was not entirely unified behind him. Support was sent. Reinforcements arrived occasionally, but not at the scale some historians believe might have changed the war's outcome. Why? The answer lies not in cowardice, but in calculation. The Council of Elders may have feared overcommitment. Iberia remained vital. Africa required defense. Trade routes needed protection. The memory of internal revolt was still fresh. Sending too much strength to Italy risked vulnerability elsewhere. Carthage's strength had always been distributed: maritime, commercial, regional. Rome's strength was concentrated. When Rome committed to war, it mobilized with singular intensity. The Roman Senate, even after catastrophic defeats, refused negotiation. After Cannae, when tens of thousands lay dead, Rome did not sue for peace. Instead, it raised new legions, restructured command, and endured. Carthage did not possess that same centralized ideological resolve. Its political system was pragmatic, not mythic. It had no grand narrative of eternal destiny. And perhaps that difference mattered more than ships or elephants. Inside Carthage's council chambers, debates likely echoed with caution. Should Hannibal be reinforced? Should resources be conserved? Should negotiations be reopened? The surviving record is fragmentary and filtered through Roman writers, but the pattern suggests hesitation, and hesitation in a war of endurance carries consequences. After Zama, when Hannibal returned to Carthage in defeat, he did not withdraw from public life immediately. In fact, he attempted reform. Hannibal was elected as one of the suffets. During his term, he sought to restructure Carthage's finances, streamline corruption, and ensure indemnity payments to Rome were managed efficiently. His reforms appear to have been effective, too effective. Roman observers grew uneasy at signs of Carthaginian recovery. Hannibal himself became a symbol of unfinished resistance. Under Roman pressure, Carthage forced him into exile. He fled eastward, eventually serving as a military advisor in various Hellenistic courts. Years later, cornered by Roman pursuit, Hannibal took his own life rather than be captured. His final reported words suggested defiance. Carthage had lost its greatest general, but the political culture that produced him remained intact, quietly efficient, economically resilient, and still, in Roman eyes, still dangerous. Within Carthage itself, daily life continued beneath these larger currents. Merchants gathered in porticos to negotiate contracts. Shipwrights repaired hulls. Farmers harvested grain from inland estates. Young boys learned navigation by watching stars over the harbor. Young girls assisted in household industries. Families gathered at evening for shared meals beneath open courtyards. The city was not consumed by constant militarism. It functioned, it traded, it prospered within limits imposed by Rome, and perhaps this prosperity, achieved without fleet, without empire, without overseas provinces, made Rome more uneasy than open aggression would have, because it demonstrated something profound. Carthage did not need conquest to thrive, it needed stability. But Rome's own expansion had created a Mediterranean order that tolerated no independent rival, however peaceful. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Roman senators increasingly framed Carthage not as a defeated enemy, but as a potential resurgence. Numidia's border disputes provided pretext. Cato's warnings provided pressure. Carthage's quiet resilience provided justification. Inside the Council of Elders, when Rome demanded hostages and weapons before the Third Punic War, the decision to comply must have been agonizing. To surrender arms, to trust Roman assurances, to hope negotiation could prevent destruction. When the final demand arrived, that the city itself be abandoned, the council chose defiance. It was no longer a question of trade or indemnities, it was a question of existence. And in that moment, Carthage's political caution gave way to collective resistance. Workshops reopened not for commerce, but for weapons. Temples yielded bronze for spearheads. Rope was woven from women's hair. The council that had once debated tariffs now organized defense. The city that had avoided unnecessary war now prepared for total siege. History sometimes turns not on battlefield genius, but on slow political currents. Carthage's internal divisions shaped Hannibal's war. Its cautious governance shaped its recovery. Its resilience shaped Rome's fear. And its final act of unity shaped its destruction. We stand now at the threshold of that final siege, not yet in flames, but in preparation. The walls still stand, the harbors still reflect the sun, the Byrsa hill still rises over the sea. But Roman legions are approaching, and the Mediterranean world is about to lose one of its oldest powers. If you are ready, in Batch 8, we will enter the Third Punic War in full, slowly, deliberately, day by day within the siege. When the Roman fleet appeared on the horizon in 149 BCE, the sea did not roar. It did not announce catastrophe with thunder. It shimmered quietly beneath the sun, as it had for centuries. But along the walls of Carthage, watchers understood what the sails meant. This was not a raid, not a border dispute, not another negotiation. This was final. The Roman army disembarked with discipline and familiarity. They had done this many times before, in Spain, in Greece, in Asia Minor. Siege warfare was not new to them. Encampments were established methodically outside the city. Ditches were dug. Defensive palisades erected. Carthage, which had once projected power outward across the Mediterranean, now stood enclosed within its own walls. Those walls were formidable, triple-layered in some sections, massive in height, reinforced with towers. Carthage had prepared for defense before, during earlier Sicilian wars, during mercenary revolt, but never under these circumstances. The city had surrendered its weapons months earlier under Roman demand. Now it had to rebuild an arsenal from nothing. Workshops became factories of desperation. Metal was scavenged from temples. Bronze statues were melted. Agricultural tools were reforged into spearheads. Old shields were repaired, repainted, redistributed. The scale of mobilization was astonishing. Ancient sources claim that thousands of weapons were produced daily: shields, swords, javelins, catapult bolts. Women are said to have cut their hair to make rope for torsion-powered siege engines. Whether symbolic exaggeration or literal truth, the image captures the atmosphere. This was no longer politics, it was survival. Inside the city, daily life contracted into defense. Markets operated irregularly. Food supplies were rationed. Families gathered indoors at night as Roman torches flickered beyond the walls. Carthage's harbor, once the pride of the Mediterranean, was now a vulnerability. Roman forces attempted to blockade the entrance, seeking to choke off supply and reinforcement. The outer harbor, rectangular and exposed, was easier to monitor. The inner circular harbor, the Kothon, still held defensive potential. Carthaginian engineers worked feverishly to strengthen sea defenses. The first Roman assaults met fierce resistance. Urban defenders knew their terrain. They fought from rooftops. They launched projectiles from towers. They repaired breaches under cover of darkness. The siege did not end quickly. Years passed. Roman commanders rotated. Early efforts were poorly coordinated. Carthage held, but Rome was patient. Roman strategy shifted from direct assault to strangulation. Supply lines were tightened. Encirclement strengthened. Allies were pressured to prevent assistance. Gradually, famine crept into the city. Grain stores dwindled. Livestock numbers fell. Hunger became a quiet enemy within the walls. Still, resistance did not collapse. Carthage had endured catastrophe before. It had rebuilt after defeat. It had survived internal revolt. It had adapted across centuries. That history sustained morale. Then, in 147 BCE, command passed to Scipio Aemilianus. Young, disciplined, determined, he understood that prolonged inefficiency would only embolden the defenders. He reorganized Roman forces. He tightened the blockade. He built a massive embankment to seal the harbor entrance completely. Carthage responded with ingenuity. In one of the most remarkable acts of the siege, Carthaginian engineers secretly constructed a new channel from the inner harbor to the sea, cutting through rock and earth, hidden from Roman view. When the new outlet was complete, Carthaginian ships suddenly emerged into open water, surprising Roman observers. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old maritime spirit of Carthage had reawakened. But the ships were few, the crews inexperienced, the Roman navy superior in numbers. The breakout failed to alter the course of the war. Roman forces gradually breached outer defenses. Fighting moved closer to the heart of the city, house by house, street by street. The narrow lanes that once carried merchants and children now carried soldiers. Buildings became fortresses. Roofs became battlements. Stone staircases became choke points. The siege entered its final phase in 146 BCE. Roman troops broke through into the lower city. Fires spread quickly among tightly packed structures. Smoke thickened the air. Carthaginian defenders retreated toward the Byrsa Hill, the ancient core of the city. There, atop the elevation first claimed in legend by Dido, the final stand took place. The fighting lasted days. Ancient accounts describe 6 days and nights of relentless combat. Families sheltered in temples, soldiers fought from collapsing walls, flames illuminated marble and stone in flickering orange light. Eventually, resistance crumbled. Some sought mercy, some sought escape. Some chose death over capture. The Roman forces took control, and then came the decision that would define history. Carthage was to be destroyed, not occupied, not repurposed immediately. Destroyed. Buildings were torn down, walls dismantled, sacred sites desecrated, harbors filled with debris. Survivors, perhaps 50,000 or more, were enslaved. The once great maritime empire ended not with negotiation, but with erasure. Scipio Aemilianus, according to later accounts, stood amid the ruins and wept, reciting lines from Homer about the fall of Troy. He is said to have reflected that Rome, too, might someday face such ruin. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as described is uncertain, but the symbolism lingers. Carthage had become another fallen city in the long arc of history. The Mediterranean now lay under Roman dominance. No rival navy challenged it. No competing superpower balanced it. The silence after destruction must have been profound. Ash settling over broken columns, smoke drifting toward the sea, the harbor waters reflecting not ships, but emptiness. And yet, even in destruction, memory persisted. Farmers continued working nearby fields. Trade routes adapted. Roman settlers would later rebuild on the same ground. But the original Carthage, the Phoenician city of traders and admirals, was gone. Not forgotten entirely, but silenced. And so we pause here, amid ruins, not to end the story, but to reflect on what has been lost. In the next batch, we will explore what happened after the flames died out, how Rome rebuilt Carthage, how memory was reshaped, and how archaeology, centuries later, began uncovering the buried city beneath Roman layers. When the fires finally died and the smoke thinned over the ruins of Carthage, the silence must have felt unnatural. For centuries, this coastline had been alive with sound. The creaking of hulls, the slap of rope against masts, the murmur of markets, the chanting of priests, the hum of negotiation in shaded courtyards. Now there was wind, and ash, and broken stone. The Roman soldiers did not remain forever. Armies move on, campaigns end. But the absence they left behind endured. Carthage was no longer a city. It was a scar on the earth. The territory was reorganized as the Roman province of Africa. Roman administrators arrived to oversee taxation and agricultural output. The surrounding countryside, fertile and productive, quickly became one of Rome's most valuable grain-producing regions. The land survived. The city did not. For nearly a century, the site of Carthage remained largely abandoned. There were scattered settlements. Farmers worked nearby fields, but the great urban center, the harbor complex, the Bursa citadel, the temples, lay in ruin, and yet history rarely tolerates emptiness in places of strategic value. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar proposed refounding Carthage as a Roman colony. His assassination delayed the plan, but the idea endured. Under Augustus, Rome officially established a new city on the same site, Roman Carthage. This was not a restoration of the old Phoenician capital. It was something different, Roman in language, Roman in architecture, Roman in civic structure. The old harbor was reshaped, forums were built, bath complexes rose, amphitheaters echoed with crowds. Within generations, Roman Carthage became one of the largest cities in the Western Empire, perhaps rivaling Alexandria and Antioch in importance. The irony is striking. Rome had destroyed Carthage out of fear that it might one day rival Roman dominance. Then Rome rebuilt it and made it Roman. But beneath Roman streets and marble columns lay older foundations: Punic stones, Phoenician walls, buried harbor slips. Memory persisted in layers. The Latin language replaced Punic in official use, but cultural echoes lingered. Agricultural knowledge, once recorded by Mago, was preserved in Roman texts. Trade networks adapted rather than vanished. Carthage had been erased politically, but not geographically. And so, centuries passed. Roman Carthage thrived. Christian communities grew there. Augustine of Hippo would later preach in its churches. The city became a major center of early Christianity. Then, in time, Rome itself weakened. Vandals captured Carthage in the 5th century CE. Byzantines reclaimed it. Arab armies arrived in the 7th century. Each wave reshaped the city. Each era layered new structures atop old ones. Eventually, the ancient harbor silted. The great buildings fell. Stone was quarried for new construction. And Carthage, both Punic and Roman, receded into fragment. For many centuries, the Phoenician city existed primarily in texts. Roman historians like Polybius, Livy, and Appian described it, often through the lens of rivalry and triumph. Greek sources offered glimpses. Archaeology remained silent beneath soil. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that systematic excavation began uncovering the deeper layers. Archaeologists found remnants of the circular harbor, confirming ancient descriptions of the Kothon. They uncovered residential districts arranged in organized grids. They discovered the Tophet, with thousands of urns carefully placed and inscribed. They traced defensive walls. They mapped workshops. They revealed streets once walked by merchants and magistrates. Each excavation complicated the Roman narrative. Carthage was not simply Rome's villain. It was an advanced urban society. Its engineering was sophisticated, its trade networks vast, its political system stable enough to endure centuries. The image of barbaric decadence, so useful to Roman propaganda, began to soften under archaeological scrutiny. Modern scholarship continues to debate many aspects of Carthaginian life. How extensive were sacrificial rituals? How democratic was its political system? How unified was its society? But one thing is no longer in doubt. Carthage was a major civilization. Its destruction altered the trajectory of Mediterranean history. Had Carthage survived as an independent power, the balance between East and West might have remained multipolar. Rome's rise to uncontested dominance accelerated in the absence of a rival. The Roman Empire, as we know it, emerged partly because Carthage did not, and so the question lingers quietly. Was Carthage's destruction inevitable, or was it the result of fear amplified by political rhetoric? Cato's repeated phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed," was not prophecy. It was persuasion. History sometimes turns on such repetition. And yet, despite destruction, something curious remains. The Mediterranean still connects the same shores. The Gulf of Tunis still reflects dawn light. Fishermen still launch boats near the ancient harbor site. If you stand there today, amid scattered columns and exposed foundations, you can see layers of time compressed into one landscape. Roman baths beside Punic walls, Christian basilicas near ancient quays, wind moving across ground that once held ships capable of challenging Rome itself. Carthage is forgotten in the sense that it no longer shapes global politics, but it is not erased from memory. It survives in archaeology, in scholarship, in fragments of text, in the legend of Hannibal crossing the Alps, in the cautionary tale of rival superpowers, and perhaps most powerfully, It survives as a reminder that dominance is never permanent. Rome destroyed Carthage, believing it secured eternal supremacy. Centuries later, Rome too would fragment. Empires rise, empires fear, empires fall. The sea remains. In the next batch, we will step back even further, exploring Carthage's cultural identity in depth, language, art, trade networks reaching beyond the Mediterranean, and the legacy of Phoenician heritage that shaped its world view. Long before Roman legions marched across its fields, before Scipio stood watching flames rise into the African sky, before Cato repeated his warning like a ritual incantation, Carthage was something quieter. It was Phoenician. To understand Carthage fully, we must return not to war, but to identity. The settlers who founded the city came from Tyre, in what is now Lebanon. They carried with them language, gods, trade knowledge, and a worldview shaped by coastlines rather than continents. The Phoenicians were not empire builders in the Roman sense. They were connectors. Their cities were strung along the Mediterranean like beads: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and later Carthage, linked by ships and shared culture. They did not seek to conquer vast inland territories. Instead, they sought access to harbors, metals, timber, trade routes. Their alphabet, simple, efficient, adaptable, would become one of their most enduring contributions to human history. From Phoenician script came the Greek alphabet, from Greek the Latin, and from Latin much of the modern written world. When Carthage rose in the western Mediterranean, it carried this linguistic inheritance. The Punic language, a Western Phoenician dialect, was spoken in its markets and council chambers. Inscriptions carved into stone stelae reveal names, dedications, prayers. Though Rome later suppressed it, Punic survived for centuries, even after the city's fall. Some rural communities in North Africa reportedly still spoke Punic well into the Roman imperial period. Language, like memory, resists erasure. Carthaginian art reflected a blend of influences: small terracotta figurines, intricate jewelry, glass beads, ivory carvings. Some motifs were distinctly Phoenician: stylized faces, symbolic gestures, sacred emblems of Tanit. Others revealed Greek influence, especially in later centuries when trade and cultural exchange intensified. Carthage was not culturally isolated. Its merchants traveled widely. Greek pottery has been found in Punic contexts. Egyptian amulets circulated through Carthaginian markets. Iberian metalwork influenced weapon designs. The Mediterranean was not divided into rigid civilizations. It was fluid. Ships carried not only goods, but ideas. Religious identity in Carthage retained strong Eastern roots. Baal-Hamon, often depicted with ram's horns, represented fertility, vegetation, cyclical renewal. Tanit, associated with protection and motherhood, became one of the most prominent deities in the Western Phoenician world. Symbols of Tanit appear frequently in Carthaginian archaeological sites: a simple geometric figure resembling a triangle topped by a line and circle. It was at once abstract and intimate. Temples were likely vibrant spaces, not dark or foreboding, but filled with incense, offerings, and ritual observance tied to agricultural and seasonal cycles. The Tophet, long interpreted by Roman writers as evidence of mass child sacrifice, remains one of the most debated aspects of Carthaginian religion. Thousands of urns containing cremated remains of infants and animals have been uncovered there. Inscriptions often dedicate the offering to Baal-Hamon or Tanit. Some scholars argue that these were sacrificial victims during times of crisis: war, famine, disaster. Others suggest the Tophet functioned as a special cemetery for children who died naturally, with ritual cremation reflecting cultural beliefs about purity and dedication. The truth may lie somewhere complex between polemic and apology. But what is certain is this: Roman accounts had motive. To portray an enemy as morally monstrous makes destruction easier to justify. Modern archaeology invites nuance. Beyond religion and art, Carthage's cultural identity was shaped by commerce. Merchants were not peripheral figures. They were central. Families built wealth over generations through maritime trade. Contracts were formalized, partnerships formed. Risk was calculated against potential gain. Carthage's worldview was outward-looking. Where Rome often conceptualized territory as land to be possessed, Carthage conceptualized territory as nodes in a network. Ports mattered more than plains. Sea lanes mattered more than roads. Control of Sicily or Sardinia was less about farmland and more about maritime corridors. This difference shaped everything. Roman expansion created provinces. Carthaginian expansion created trading zones. Even in warfare, this mindset persisted. Hannibal's invasion of Italy was not an attempt to conquer and administer the peninsula permanently. It was designed to fracture Rome's alliances, to weaken its network of support, to force negotiation. He understood systems, but Rome understood resilience. Carthage's cultural temperament leaned toward negotiation and adaptation. Rome's leaned toward consolidation and endurance. Over centuries, these differing mentalities would collide. Even Carthage's military structure reflected its commercial DNA. Rather than relying solely on citizen soldiers, Carthage employed mercenaries and allied contingents, Iberian infantry, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers. This diversity gave Carthage tactical flexibility, but it also required constant funding. When finances faltered, loyalty could falter. The mercenary war after the First Punic War exposed this vulnerability painfully. Yet it would be simplistic to say Carthage lacked civic identity. Citizens defended their city fiercely during the Third Punic War. Workshops transformed into armories. Collective sacrifice replaced mercenary reliance. Identity crystallizes under threat. Perhaps Carthage's identity, long diffused across trade networks and overseas territories, became most visible at the moment of extinction. And then there is the question of memory. Why is Carthage less remembered than Rome? Partly because Rome survived. Partly because Rome wrote the histories that shaped Western education. Partly because physical monuments in Rome endured: arches, roads, aqueducts. Carthage's monuments were dismantled. But memory persists in unexpected ways. The name Hannibal still evokes astonishment: elephants crossing snowy peaks. The word Punic still appears in textbooks. The alphabet you read now carries distant Phoenician ancestry. Carthage's influence is embedded invisibly in systems we take for granted. If you walk through the ruins today, you will not see towering Punic temples intact. You will see foundations, fragments, layered strata where Roman columns stand atop older stone. But beneath those layers lies continuity. A city founded by exiles, built by merchants, expanded by generals, destroyed by fear. The forgotten city of Carthage is not forgotten because it lacked greatness. It is forgotten because its rival ensured its silence. And yet, when the Mediterranean wind moves across the Tunisian coast at sunset, when the water glows gold and quiet boats drift across the harbor where the Kothon once stood, it is possible to imagine the hum of a different world, a world where ships carried purple dye westward, where silver from Iberia glittered in treasury vaults, where a child once stood beside his father at an altar and swore an oath against Rome. The story is not merely about destruction, it is about connection, about resilience, about rivalry, and about how easily a civilization can vanish from common memory, even when it once ruled the sea. When you're ready, we will move next into a deeper exploration of Hannibal himself, not only as a general, but as a product of Carthaginian culture and political tension. Before he was a legend carved into Roman memory, before elephants climbed alpine passes beneath snow and wind, before senators whispered his name in fear, Hannibal was a child in a harbor city. He grew up not in Rome's shadow, but beneath the African sun, in a household shaped by ambition and unfinished war. His father, Hamilcar Barca, did not raise him in peace. Hamilcar had fought Rome in Sicily during the First Punic War. He had watched Carthage lose its fleet. He had endured the humiliation of indemnity payments. He had nearly seen his city collapse during the mercenary revolt. For Hamilcar, Rome was not an abstract rival. It was a wound, and children raised in the presence of wounded pride absorb it quietly. Ancient writers tell us that before departing for Iberia, Hamilcar brought the young Hannibal to a temple altar and made him swear eternal enmity toward Rome. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as described, its symbolism is powerful. Hannibal's identity was forged in opposition, but it would be too simple to describe him as driven only by hatred. He was shaped by Carthage's wider culture. He learned languages, not just Punic, but likely Iberian dialects and perhaps Greek. He observed how alliances were negotiated, how mercenary forces were integrated, how trade networks funded military campaigns. He grew up watching his father operate not only as a general, but as a statesman carving out influence in Iberia. Carthage's worldview, pragmatic, outward-looking, adaptable, became his foundation. Unlike Roman commanders who often rose through structured political offices, Hannibal's path was tied to family legacy. The Barcid household in Iberia functioned almost as a parallel center of power within the Carthaginian sphere. Carthago Nova became both military base and administrative hub. Silver from Iberian mines funded expansion. Local tribes were courted, subdued, or integrated. Hannibal grew to adulthood in an environment of constant movement. He learned logistics, how to feed thousands of soldiers across foreign terrain. He learned diplomacy, how to secure loyalty from diverse peoples. He learned patience, how to wait for opportunity. By his mid-20s, when he assumed command after Hasdrubal's assassination, he was not reckless youth. He was experienced. The siege of Saguntum was not an impulsive act. It was calculated. Saguntum lay south of the Ebro River, technically within Carthaginian influence under treaty terms. But its alignment with Rome created strategic tension. By attacking Saguntum, Hannibal tested Roman resolve. Rome responded with outrage. War followed. Yet even then, Hannibal did not act hastily. His march toward Italy was not a straight dash across the Alps. It was a carefully prepared campaign. He secured alliances among Gallic tribes. He ensured supply lines across Iberia. He left trusted commanders behind. The crossing of the Alps, so often romanticized, was not theatrical ambition. It was strategic surprise. Rome expected confrontation in Spain or North Africa. Hannibal understood psychology. Appearing in Italy disrupted Roman assumptions. But Hannibal was not simply bold. He was attentive. After victories like Trebia and Trasimene, he did not march directly on Rome. He understood that Rome's strength lay not only in its city walls, but in its network of Italian allies. His strategy aimed to fracture that network. At Cannae, his tactical brilliance reached its apex. The double envelopment, allowing Roman forces to press inward before closing the trap, required extraordinary discipline among his troops. Iberians and Gauls held the center. African infantry pivoted inward. Numidian cavalry swept the flanks. The maneuver was precise, the result devastating. Yet even after Cannae, Hannibal did not receive the level of reinforcement that might have tipped the balance permanently. Here again, Carthaginian political culture intersected with military reality. The Council of Elders may have doubted the sustainability of deep Italian campaigning. They may have prioritized Iberian defense, and they may have feared overextension. Hannibal operated far from home. Brilliant, but constrained. For over a decade, he maneuvered across Italy, winning engagements, maintaining alliances, but never delivering the final blow. Rome adapted. Fabius avoided direct battle. Scipio attacked Iberia. Roman persistence wore down Carthaginian resources. Hannibal's campaign became a long stalemate of endurance, and endurance favored Rome. When he was recalled to Africa to confront Scipio at Zama, Hannibal faced circumstances different from his Italian victories. His veteran troops were fewer, his cavalry less dominant. His elephants neutralized effectively. Defeat followed. Afterward, Hannibal returned not to rebellion, but to reform. As suffet, he tackled corruption and financial inefficiency. He sought to make Carthage stronger within the treaty's constraints. In this, he resembled Roman reformers more than enemy caricatures. But Rome feared him still. His presence alone was destabilizing. Exile removed him physically from Carthage, but his legacy remained. In Roman literature, Hannibal became both villain and model, a dangerous adversary, yet admired for his skill. Even Roman generals studied his tactics. Cannae became a template analyzed for centuries. Hannibal's story illustrates something essential about Carthage. It was capable of producing leaders of extraordinary vision. It fostered cross-cultural military systems. It integrated diverse peoples into coherent armies. It embraced innovation when needed, yet it lacked Rome's relentless institutional unity. Hannibal fought as an individual genius supported by a city divided in caution. Rome fought as a collective organism, and in long wars, collective organisms endure. When Hannibal died, reportedly taking poison to avoid Roman capture, he left behind more than legend. He left behind a question. If Carthage had committed fully to his strategy, if reinforcements had arrived at decisive moments, if political unity had matched military brilliance, would the Mediterranean world have looked different? We cannot know. But we can see that Carthage's fate was not sealed by weakness alone. It was shaped by structure, by temperament, by choices made in council chambers far from battlefields. Hannibal was not the entire story of Carthage, but through him we glimpse its strengths and its limits. A city brilliant in commerce, innovative in war, cautious in politics, resilient in recovery, and ultimately unable to coexist with a rival equally determined to dominate. When you are ready, we will step even deeper into the contrast between Rome and Carthage, examining how two different worldviews competed for control of the same sea. Stand for a moment on the shoreline between Italy and North Africa. The sea looks the same from both sides, blue, wide, open, and yet to Rome and to Carthage, that same sea meant something very different. For Carthage, the Mediterranean was a network. It was movement, exchange, connection. Ships departed, returned, departed again. Trade routes curved like threads stitching distant coasts together. Ports were not endpoints. They were links in a chain. Power, in the Carthaginian imagination, flowed along water. For Rome, the Mediterranean became something else. After Carthage fell, the Romans would call it Mare Nostrum, our sea, ownership, control, dominion. Where Carthage saw corridors, Rome saw borders. Where Carthage calculated profit, Rome calculated security. This difference in worldview did not appear suddenly during the Punic Wars. It developed over centuries of expansion. Rome's early struggles were terrestrial. The Republic learned to conquer neighboring hills, plains, and fortified towns. It built roads to connect territory. It granted varying degrees of citizenship to subdued peoples. It incorporated allies into a growing land-based system. Rome expanded by absorbing. Carthage expanded by linking. These two approaches could coexist for a time. But once Rome looked beyond the Italian peninsula, collision was inevitable. After the First Punic War, Rome had gained Sicily, its first overseas province. In doing so, it stepped into a maritime framework previously dominated by Carthage. Rome learned quickly. It adapted its navy, it built ports, it organized fleets. But Rome did not become Carthage. It transformed naval control into territorial control. Where Carthage might secure a harbor for trade advantage, Rome secured it as a stepping stone for further conquest. After defeating Macedon, Rome extended influence into Greece. After intervening in Asia Minor, it shaped politics in the eastern Mediterranean. The Republic became an empire long before it admitted it. Carthage, by contrast, never sought to conquer Greece. It never sought to annex distant inland kingdoms. Its ambitions were broad, but not universal. Or perhaps this difference explains the final fear in Rome. A rival with limited ambition can coexist. A rival that controls networks can disrupt. Even weakened after the Second Punic War, Carthage retained something Rome could not tolerate: economic independence. Carthage did not need Roman protection. It did not need Roman markets. It paid indemnities efficiently and rebuilt quietly. It did not bow culturally. Its language persisted. Its traditions endured. Its agricultural techniques flourished. To Roman senators like Cato, this resilience implied potential resurgence. And Rome did not accept potential rivals lightly. The decision to destroy Carthage was not purely strategic, it was psychological. Rome had survived Hannibal. It had nearly been broken at Cannae. It had mobilized every resource. It had endured existential fear. And when an empire survives fear, it often seeks to eliminate its source permanently. Carthage became that source. Even if it posed no immediate military threat, its memory of past strength remained. Its harbor still faced the sea. Its walls still rose above fertile plains. Its location still commanded the crossroads between east and west. Rome chose certainty over coexistence, and in doing so, it reshaped the Mediterranean. Without Carthage as counterweight, Rome's expansion accelerated. North Africa became a breadbasket province. Spain yielded silver under Roman administration. The Western Mediterranean unified under one power. The Third Punic War lasted only 3 years. The psychological war had lasted generations, yet even after destruction, Rome inherited more from Carthage than it admitted: agricultural knowledge, naval techniques, trade patterns, urban planning insights. The Roman colony built atop Carthage benefited from centuries of accumulated geographic wisdom. Carthage's location had not been accidental. Its founders chose well. Rome recognized that. It destroyed the city and then rebuilt in the same place. History is full of such contradictions. In studying Carthage and Rome side by side, we see not simply enemy states, but competing visions of power. One rooted in mobility and negotiation, one rooted in consolidation and endurance, both effective, both adaptive, both ruthless when necessary, but only one survived intact, and survival shapes narrative. Roman historians wrote extensively. Roman monuments endured. Roman law influenced future systems. Carthage's texts were largely lost, its monuments dismantled, its voice filtered through enemy accounts. This asymmetry shapes modern perception, yet archaeology continues to rebalance the story. The circular harbor confirms engineering sophistication. The residential grid reveals planning discipline. The Tophet complicates moral judgments. Trade artifacts reveal global connections. Carthage was not a shadow civilization. It was not primitive. It was not merely the backdrop for Hannibal's brilliance. It was an alternative model of Mediterranean dominance. Its destruction was not inevitable. It was chosen. When we reflect on the forgotten city of Carthage, we are not merely recounting battles. We are considering how rival systems compete, how fear escalates, how rhetoric shapes policy, how memory is curated by survivors, and how easily a civilization can be reduced to footnotes when its libraries burn. Yet even in footnotes, truth waits. In stone fragments, in buried docks, in inscriptions weathered by wind. Carthage reminds us that power is not permanent, that trade can build empires as surely as armies, that adaptation can sustain societies for centuries, and that destruction, once unleashed, rarely distinguishes between soldier and scholar. The sea that once carried Carthaginian ships now carries cargo vessels under many flags. But it is still the same sea, and beneath its surface, history rests quietly, patient, layered, waiting to be remembered. When you are ready, we will begin the final arc of this 20-batch journey, reflecting on Carthage's long-term legacy and its place in global history. Long after the last Punic inscription was carved, long after the final ember cooled on the Bursa hill, long after Roman colonists laid out their new streets over the old foundations, Carthage continued to shape the world in ways few people recognize. History often remembers victors loudly, but influence does not always follow noise. Sometimes it lingers quietly, embedded in systems that outlive their creators. Consider the alphabet you are reading now. The Phoenician script, carried westward by traders long before Rome dominated the Mediterranean, formed the structural ancestor of the Greek alphabet. Greek, in turn, shaped Latin. Latin became the foundation for much of modern European writing. Carthage did not invent literacy, but it transmitted a tool that reshaped communication across civilizations. Its influence survives invisibly in letters and words. Consider maritime commerce. The idea of coastal trading hubs linked by standardized contracts, protected harbors, and long-distance agreements did not begin with Rome's empire. It matured in Phoenician and Carthaginian practice. Carthage demonstrated that wealth could be generated not through territorial conquest alone, but through network control. That model echoes in later mercantile powers. Venice, Genoa, even modern port-based economies. Control the sea lanes, control the exchange, prosper without occupying every inland valley. Carthage's agricultural expertise also endured. The Roman Senate, after destroying the city, preserved Mago's agricultural treatise because it recognized its value. Roman farmers studied Carthaginian methods, vineyard management, soil treatment, livestock breeding. Knowledge survived where walls did not. There is something deeply human in that. Even enemies preserve what works. But legacy is not only technical, it is also cautionary. Carthage stands as one of history's starkest examples of annihilation driven by fear. The Third Punic War was not fought because Carthage had launched invasion. It was fought because Rome decided that even potential rivalry was unacceptable. That decision reshaped geopolitics. Without Carthage, Rome's western expansion faced no equal counterweight. The Mediterranean unified under Roman control. For centuries, that unity enabled relative stability. the Pax Romana. Trade flourished, infrastructure expanded, law standardized. But unity achieved through elimination carries moral complexity. And Carthage reminds us that security can become obsession, that preemptive destruction can be justified through rhetoric, that fear, repeated often enough in a Senate chamber, can become policy. And yet, Carthage was not a passive victim. It fought, it resisted, it sought power in its own way. The Punic Wars were not morality plays of good and evil. They were collisions of ambition. When modern visitors walk through the archaeological park near Tunis, they encounter layers. Roman baths stand prominently. Christian basilicas emerge in partial reconstruction. Tourists photograph columns against blue sky. But Punic Carthage is subtler. Foundations beneath foundations. Circular harbor outlines traced from above. Tophet stelae arranged in quiet rows. The Punic city does not dominate the skyline. It whispers from the ground. This subtlety contributes to its obscurity. Rome's architecture projects upward. Carthage's remains lie embedded below. But archaeology continues to peel back those layers. Each excavation restores dimension. Each inscription translates another fragment of voice. The forgotten city is slowly being remembered. Modern scholarship paints a more balanced portrait. Carthage as innovative rather than barbaric, as complex rather than cruel, as strategic rather than reckless. Its destruction was not proof of inferiority. It was proof of rivalry. There is also something poetic in Carthage's rebirth as Roman Carthage. The very site Rome sought to erase became one of its most important African cities. Grain from the surrounding countryside fed Rome's population. Christian theology flourished there. St. Augustine would later shape Western thought from nearby Hippo. The ground of Carthage continued influencing history long after its political identity vanished. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Civilizations rarely disappear entirely. They transform, they integrate, they leave residue in culture and structure. Even when libraries burn, ideas migrate. Even when walls fall, techniques persist. Even when names are cursed in Senate speeches, memory endures in unexpected forms. And so when we call Carthage forgotten, we must be careful. Forgotten by whom? Forgotten in what context? It is absent from casual popular memory, but it is present in academic study, in maritime history, in archaeological discourse, in discussions of empire and annihilation. It survives in the story of Hannibal told to school children, in the phrase Punic Wars, in the enduring fascination with elephants crossing the Alps. The forgotten city of Carthage is not truly gone. It rests beneath narratives dominated by Rome. And when we step back, when we look beyond triumphal arches and imperial monuments, we see a more balanced Mediterranean past. Two powers, two visions, one sea. Only one endured politically, but both shaped history. As the sun sets over the Gulf of Tunis today, the light reflects across water that once held Carthaginian fleets. Fishing boats drift where quinqueremes once waited. Wind moves across the Byrsa hill, now peaceful. The stones do not speak loudly, but they remain. And in remaining, they ask us to reconsider what it means to win and what it means to be erased. When you're ready, we will move toward the final reflective arc of this 20-batch series, drawing together Carthage's story into a slow, meditative conclusion designed for deep, immersive listening. If you stand on the Byrsa hill at dusk, when the air cools and the sky turns the color of faded copper, it becomes easier to imagine how memory works. The modern world hums faintly in the distance, cars, voices, the sound of a city that is no longer Carthage. But beneath your feet lie layers of stone laid more than 2,000 years ago, foundations of homes, fragments of walls, traces of streets that once climbed this slope in ordered tiers. History rarely disappears in a single moment. It settles, layer by layer. Carthage's destruction in 146 BCE felt final to those who witnessed it. Flames erased the skyline. Smoke obscured the harbor. Modern survivors were led away in chains. But erasure in politics is not erasure in reality. The earth remembers. Archaeologists digging centuries later did not find an empty site. They found continuity interrupted, not erased. They found pottery shards stamped with Punic inscriptions. They found drainage systems carefully engineered. They found evidence of urban planning that rivaled contemporary Greek cities. They found a civilization that had not been chaotic or primitive, but structured and deliberate. In the Roman imagination, Carthage had to be portrayed as decadent, cruel, unstable. It justified the decision to destroy it, but physical evidence complicates propaganda. When you walk through the remains of the circular harbor today, now little more than an outline visible from above, you begin to understand its sophistication. It was not simply a dock, it was a naval machine. Ships could be constructed, stored, repaired, launched with efficiency that even Roman engineers later admired. The inner island allowed centralized command. The outer harbor facilitated commerce. It was design born of generations of experience at sea. Nearby, the Tophet stands as a quiet field of stone markers, each stela carved with symbols, each urn carefully placed. It is a solemn place, not theatrical, not sensational. Debates about its meaning continue among scholars. But standing there, what strikes you most is the order, the intention, the continuity of ritual practice. This was not a chaotic people. It was a society with structure, with tradition, with spiritual rhythm. Beyond religious sites, residential excavations reveal something else. Carthaginian homes were arranged in blocks, with internal courtyards that allowed light and air into domestic spaces. Drainage channels ran beneath streets. Water systems were organized. Urban planning was not improvised. It was thoughtful. These details matter. They shift perception. They remind us that Carthage was not merely Rome's antagonist in a war epic. It was a city of families, of administrators, of craftsmen, of sailors who returned home at sunset and placed their tools aside. And yet, for many centuries, these ordinary dimensions were overshadowed by military narrative. Hannibal's elephants dominate popular imagination. The burning city dominates textbook summaries. The quiet centuries of trade and governance fade into background. But when we slow down, when we allow the story to breathe, Carthage becomes more than a cautionary tale. It becomes a study in alternative power. What if the Mediterranean had developed under continued dual dominance? What if Rome and Carthage had negotiated coexistence? Would expansion into Greece and Asia have unfolded differently? Would Roman imperial structure have softened in the presence of a strong Western counterbalance? We cannot rewrite the past, but we can examine the fork in the road. Carthage's annihilation cleared the way for Rome's uncontested Western expansion. Without Carthage, Rome's maritime supremacy solidified. Without a rival fleet, Rome's trade routes faced fewer threats. Without fear of resurgence, Rome's Senate turned attention elsewhere. Power consolidated. But consolidation always narrows diversity. Two models of governance had existed in tension: Carthage's mercantile oligarchy, Rome's militarized republic evolving toward empire. When one disappeared, the Mediterranean lost an experiment in plural balance. History often celebrates unity, but unity sometimes follows destruction, and destruction carries silence. The silence after Carthage's fall echoes not only in ruins, but in narrative gaps. We do not possess Punic epics recounting their own perspective. We do not read Carthaginian historians defending their policies. We rely on Roman authors, Greek intermediaries, and archaeological fragments. The voice of Carthage reaches us through broken pottery and filtered testimony. Yet even in fragment, identity persists. The Phoenician instinct to connect rather than dominate. The reliance on commerce rather than conquest as primary growth. The flexibility in adapting foreign influences into local culture. These traits did not vanish from human history. They reappeared in later maritime republics. They echo in global trade networks today. Carthage's story is not solely about destruction. It is about adaptation across centuries until adaptation could no longer prevent annihilation. And perhaps that is the deepest reflection. Adaptation works until a rival decides coexistence is unacceptable. When fear overrides calculation, even resilient systems can fall. As night settles over the ruins now, the modern lights of Tunis glow faintly in the distance. The sea remains steady. It has seen Phoenician sails, Roman triremes, Byzantine fleets, Arab traders, European colonial ships, modern cargo vessels. Empires pass. The water endures. Carthage, once master of that water, no longer commands it. But its memory lingers in every discussion of rivalry, in every study of ancient trade, in every debate about whether security demands destruction. The forgotten city of Carthage is not simply a chapter of the Punic Wars. It is a meditation on power, on resilience, on fear, on the thin line between coexistence and annihilation. We have reached the reflective stage of this journey. In the next batch, we will begin drawing the story toward its slow, immersive closing, returning to the sea, to the harbor, to the idea of memory itself. Close your eyes again and return to the shoreline. Not the shoreline of battle, not the shoreline crowded with Roman ships, but the earlier one, the quiet one. The moment before history hardened into inevitability. A Phoenician vessel approaches the North African coast. Its sail is dyed faintly with the colors of Tyre. The crew has been at sea for weeks. They have followed stars across open water, hugging coastlines when they could, trusting currents when they had to. Ahead, a low hill rises above a natural harbor. The water is deep enough for ships, the land fertile enough for crops, the position strategic enough for trade. They disembark, they build, they begin. This is where Carthage truly lives, not in flames, not in defeat, but in beginnings. For centuries, that beginning expanded outward like ripples in water. A dock becomes a harbor becomes a fleet becomes a network becomes an empire of influence. Carthage did not wake one morning and decide to challenge Rome. It grew gradually into a position where challenge became unavoidable. We often compress history into dramatic confrontations, but most civilizations rise through routine, through agreements signed quietly, through goods exchanged peacefully, through skills refined patiently. Carthage mastered routine. It built wealth steadily. It expanded influence cautiously. It absorbed foreign elements pragmatically. Its strength was subtle, and subtle strength is often underestimated. Rome did not underestimate it. Rome feared it. When Cato ended every speech with the same phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed," he was not reacting to immediate invasion. He was reacting to potential. Potential for resurgence, potential for rivalry, potential for balance. So balance unsettles empires that desire supremacy. And so Carthage's fate was sealed not by one battle, but by a long accumulation of Roman anxiety. Yet even as Roman soldiers dismantled walls, they could not dismantle everything. They could not dismantle the coastline. They could not dismantle the harbor's natural curve. They could not dismantle the agricultural richness of the hinterland. So Rome rebuilt, and in rebuilding, it acknowledged something quietly. Carthage had chosen well. The location that once empowered a Phoenician colony now empowered a Roman province. History rarely erases geography. It repurposes it. In the centuries after its destruction, Roman Carthage became a center of grain supply, theology, and culture. St. Augustine would later write near these shores. Christian communities would flourish. The same hill that once held Tanit's temple would later echo with new prayers. Civilizations shift, foundations endure. When we reflect on Carthage now, in the quiet of modern study, we see not a villain erased by destiny. We see a civilization that thrived through adaptation until confronted by a rival unwilling to share space. We see a maritime power built on connection rather than territorial absorption. We see political caution that both preserved and limited it. We see brilliance in Hannibal, restraint in council chambers, resilience after defeat. And we see the consequences of fear hardened into policy. Carthage's story invites us to consider how we define strength. Is strength domination? Is strength survival? Is strength adaptation? Carthage survived multiple catastrophes. It rebuilt after naval defeat. It crushed internal revolt. It repaid crushing indemnities. It prospered under restriction, but it could not survive the determination of a rival empire convinced that its very existence was unacceptable. And so the city burned. Yet when we walk among its ruins today, the sensation is not solely tragedy. It is continuity. Wind moves across the Gulf of Tunis, just as it did 3,000 years ago. The sea glimmers under the same sun. Fishermen cast nets where quinqueremes once maneuvered. Children play in neighborhoods layered above ancient streets. The world continues. And Carthage, though politically extinguished, remains part of that continuity. It lives in academic debate, in archaeological excavation, in the enduring fascination with the Punic Wars. It lives in questions about coexistence and annihilation. It lives in the alphabet, in maritime commerce, in the cautionary tales of empire. The forgotten city of Carthage is not forgotten because it lacked greatness. It is forgotten because it was defeated by a civilization that wrote more loudly. But when we slow down, when we listen beyond the noise of triumph, we can still hear the quieter rhythm of oars in early morning water. We can still imagine merchants calculating exchange rates in shaded courtyards. We can still see a child standing beside his father, watching ships depart, absorbing stories of rivalry that will shape his life. History is not only what survives intact, it is also what survives in fragments. And fragments, when assembled carefully, reveal complexity. As we move toward the closing chapters of this long reflection, we will gather those fragments, memory, the archaeology, rivalry, resilience, into a final meditation on what Carthage teaches us about power and impermanence. There is a strange kind of quiet that follows the fall of a great city. Not the immediate silence after battle, not the crackle of dying flames or the echo of collapsing stone, but the longer quiet that stretches across generations. A quiet in which children grow up unaware of what once stood beneath their feet. A quiet in which fishermen mend nets along a shore that once held a fleet capable of challenging the greatest republic of the ancient world. Carthage entered that quiet, and yet, even in silence, it shaped the centuries that followed. After Rome rebuilt the city as a colony, the memory of Punic Carthage was deliberately softened. The narrative emphasized Roman victory, Roman order, Roman civilization replacing barbarism. But beneath that narrative, Daily life resumed in rhythms not entirely unfamiliar to the ancient Phoenicians. Ships returned to the harbor. Markets reopened. Grain flowed outward toward Italy. North Africa became indispensable to Roman survival. The irony deepened. Rome had destroyed Carthage to remove a rival maritime power. Yet it relied heavily on the same geography, the same fertile hinterland, the same coastal access that had made Carthage powerful in the first place. The land that once funded Carthaginian fleets now fed Roman legions. The coastline that once launched quinqueremes now launched Roman grain shipments. Power changes hands. Geography does not. Over time, even Roman citizens forgot the intensity of the old rivalry. For them, Carthage became simply another major city of the empire, prosperous, cultured, African, yet Romanized. Christian communities flourished there in the first centuries of the Common Era. Theologians debated doctrine in its basilicas. Philosophers lectured in its streets. The city became part of Rome's internal world, not its external threat. And in that transformation lies one of history's most profound paradoxes. The place Rome once feared so deeply became essential to its stability. Yet memory of the Punic city remained filtered through old anxieties. Roman literature preserved Hannibal as both enemy and genius. His name endured long after his homeland's identity dissolved. But the broader Carthaginian civilization, its merchants, its sailors, its magistrates, faded into background. Why do some civilizations become mythologized while others recede? Part of the answer lies in continuity of narrative. Rome's institutions evolved into empire. Its language influenced Europe. Its legal concepts shaped governance. Carthage's political structures ended abruptly. Without institutional survival, narrative thins. And yet modern scholarship continues to thicken it again. Excavations in the 20th century revealed urban planning more advanced than previously acknowledged. The circular harbor confirmed ancient descriptions once dismissed as exaggeration. Agricultural treatises highlighted technical sophistication. Each discovery complicates the older Roman caricature. Carthage was not decadent chaos. It was structured resilience. And resilience, perhaps, is the thread that runs through its entire story. Founded by exiles, expanded through trade, defeated, rebuilt, crushed, remembered. Resilience defined it until annihilation halted adaptation. But even annihilation did not erase influence. When Islamic powers later expanded across North Africa, they too recognized the strategic value of the coastline. The region remained central to Mediterranean exchange. Carthage's geographic logic continued guiding history. Even today, Tunis stands not far from where Punic ships once docked. The shoreline curves the same way. The wind follows similar patterns. The sea remains constant, and if you imagine standing there at sunrise, before the modern world fully awakens, you might sense something layered beneath the present. Not ghosts, not ruins, but continuity, a reminder that cities are more than walls and rulers. They are accumulations of human intention. Carthage's intention was connection, connection across distance, connection through commerce, connection across cultures. Its fleets sailed beyond familiar waters. Its merchants navigated uncertainty. Its generals integrated diverse peoples into unified strategy. This outward-looking instinct set it apart. Rome expanded outward too, but with a different end goal. Rome absorbed. Carthage linked. In the end, absorption proved more durable than linkage. But linkage left marks. The Mediterranean's history of trade did not begin with Rome, nor did it end with Carthage. Carthage was a vital bridge between East and West, between Levantine heritage and Western expansion, between ancient Phoenician culture and emerging Roman dominance. When we call it forgotten, we must remember that forgetting is often selective. We remember Rome's monuments because they still stand in monumental form. We forget Carthage because its monuments were dismantled and repurposed. But absence of visible grandeur does not equal absence of impact. Carthage's story teaches something subtle and powerful. Greatness does not guarantee survival. Innovation does not guarantee security. Resilience does not guarantee coexistence. Sometimes the fate of a civilization hinges on whether its rival can tolerate its presence. And sometimes tolerance collapses under fear. As twilight settles over this long reflection, we begin to feel the arc of Carthage's existence not as a straight line toward destruction, but as a wide curve, a curve that rises gently from Phoenician colonization, expands confidently through trade, sharpens into rivalry, burns in conflict, and then diffuses into memory. The forgotten city is not entirely lost. It is diffused, layered, embedded, interwoven into broader Mediterranean history. And as we approach the final chapters of this journey, we will slow even further, moving away from events and toward reflection, not just what happened, but what it means. Imagine the Mediterranean not as a map, not as a battlefield, not as a stage for rival empires, but simply as water, endless breathing water. Long before Rome, long before Carthage, long before any flag claimed its surface. The sea does not remember in the way we do. It does not keep records of treaties. It does not mourn fallen cities. It does not honor victors. It carries ships. It erodes stone. It reflects the sun. And yet, for centuries, Carthage understood this sea more intimately than almost any other power in the Western Mediterranean. To the Carthaginians, the sea was not a boundary. It was possibility, a road without ruts, a highway without walls. When they launched ships from the Kothon harbor, they were not merely transporting goods. They were participating in a worldview built on movement. Movement requires trust. Trust in sailors, trust in navigation, trust in agreements made across languages and cultures. Carthage's civilization depended on that trust. Its wealth did not grow from fortifying every hilltop. It grew from knowing which winds would carry a vessel from North Africa to Iberia, from knowing how to negotiate safe harbor in distant ports, from knowing how to balance risk and reward. This worldview made Carthage adaptable, but it also made it vulnerable, because trust can be broken. And when a rival power rejects coexistence, networks become exposed. Rome, after surviving Hannibal, chose not to share the sea. It chose exclusivity, and exclusivity reshaped the Mediterranean. But let us pause here, not to judge, not to assign morality, but to observe. Two civilizations rose on opposite shores, one oriented toward land, one oriented toward sea, both intelligent, both disciplined, both ambitious. Their collision was not inevitable from the beginning. For centuries they developed independently. Only when their spheres overlapped did tension harden into war. And once war hardened into memory, memory hardened into fear. Fear, repeated often enough, becomes policy. Policy, enacted decisively, becomes destruction. Carthage's final years were not marked by arrogance. They were marked by resilience under constraint. After the Second Punic War, Carthage complied with treaty terms. It rebuilt economically. It avoided unauthorized warfare until provoked by regional pressure. It did not march on Rome. It did not rebuild its navy secretly. It did not launch preemptive campaigns. Its very success in recovery unsettled Rome. That detail lingers. Prosperity alone can be perceived as threat. And when perception becomes political consensus, action follows. As we reflect on Carthage now, thousands of years removed, we see a pattern repeated throughout history. Rival powers compete. One emerges dominant, the other is diminished, sometimes absorbed, sometimes erased, but erasure is rarely complete. Carthage's harbor may be silted, its temples may be rubble, its language may no longer be spoken in marketplaces, yet its imprint remains in maritime law traditions, in trade network models, in agricultural techniques transmitted to Rome, in the very alphabetic lineage of modern writing. Carthage did not leave behind monumental ruins on the scale of Rome. It left behind systems, and systems often outlast stone. If you walk along the coastline near ancient Carthage today, you will see modern ships in the distance, cargo vessels tracing routes between Europe, Africa, and beyond. The pattern is ancient, the cargo different, the flags different, the technology advanced, but the idea remains. Movement across water, exchange across cultures, connection beyond borders. That idea thrived in Carthage long before it was formalized in global trade theory. As night deepens over the Mediterranean, imagine the final Punic sailors, perhaps unaware that their city's days were numbered, guiding ships home under starlight. Stars were their maps, waves their roads. They could not foresee Roman legions dismantling their harbor. They could not foresee future archaeologists brushing dust from broken pottery. They knew only the present rhythm, the pull of tide, the creak of hull, the quiet satisfaction of safe return. Civilizations often end abruptly, but lived experience rarely feels abrupt while it unfolds. Carthage's citizens did not live in constant awareness of impending annihilation. They lived in markets and homes. They debated policy in council chambers. They celebrated festivals. They mourned losses. They watched ships depart. Ordinary life persisted until extraordinary decision intervened. And that is perhaps the final humanizing element of this story. Carthage was not a mythic antagonist. It was a city of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by forces larger than themselves. Their story invites us to look beyond conquerors and examine communities, to look beyond rhetoric and examine reality, to look beyond ruins and examine continuity. As we move toward the final chapters of this long meditation, we will gather these reflections into a closing vision, not of flames, but of horizon, not of defeat, but of memory carried forward. Let us move now away from armies and Senate chambers, away from treaties and ultimatums, away from fire. Return instead to a single morning in Carthage, not the last morning, not the first, just one of the thousands in between. The sun rises slowly over the gulf. Light spills across whitewashed walls and flat rooftops. The air is cool for a brief hour before heat settles in. Somewhere in the lower city, a baker opens his oven. Somewhere near the harbor, a dock worker checks rope for fraying. A merchant's apprentice counts amphorae stacked neatly against a warehouse wall. No one speaks of Rome in that moment. No one imagines the Senate debating their fate. Life unfolds in ordinary rhythm, and that is the most difficult thing to recover in history, the ordinary. We inherit wars and dates and famous names, but civilizations are sustained by routine, by repetition, by habit, by systems that function quietly beneath drama. Carthage functioned. Its streets were laid in order, its water systems managed carefully, its agricultural hinterland cultivated methodically. It had weathered storms before, literal and political. It had survived defeat in Sicily. It had survived mercenary revolt. It had survived indemnities. Resilience becomes habit when practiced long enough. And perhaps that habit made it difficult for Carthage's leaders to fully grasp Rome's final resolve. For centuries, conflicts had ended in treaty. Negotiation had been possible. Compromise had been realistic. The Third Punic War broke that pattern. Rome no longer sought concession, it sought elimination. For Carthage, this shift must have felt surreal. To comply with escalating demands, to surrender weapons, to hand over hostages, to hope for mercy, and then to be told that the city itself must vanish. The moment that final demand was delivered, something ancient within Carthage awakened. Not maritime ambition, not mercantile calculation, but collective identity. Workshops transformed overnight, metal reforged, walls reinforced, families prepared for siege. The city that had often relied on mercenaries now relied on citizens. The merchant became defender, the artisan became armorer, the farmer became soldier. In its final years, Carthage revealed a dimension often overlooked: unity under threat, even as famine crept in, even as Roman encirclement tightened, even as hope narrowed, resistance persisted. There is dignity in that resistance, not because it succeeded, but because it affirmed identity. When we reflect on Carthage now, we often focus on Hannibal's brilliance or Rome's ruthlessness, but between those poles lies something more subtle: the capacity of a city to endure across centuries, founded by exiles, built by traders, expanded by generals, rebuilt after disaster, destroyed by decision. 6 centuries is not a fleeting existence. It is generational continuity. It is grandparents teaching grandchildren. It is knowledge passed quietly across time. It is architecture refined and rebuilt. Carthage's story reminds us that endurance does not guarantee permanence, but it does create legacy, and legacy, even when fractured, influences what follows. Rome absorbed North Africa into its empire. It inherited agricultural expertise. It inherited infrastructure patterns. It inherited strategic awareness of Mediterranean trade. The conqueror often carries forward the strengths of the conquered, sometimes unknowingly. The Mediterranean after Carthage did not revert to emptiness. It reorganized. Under Rome, it became a unified economic zone. Goods moved with fewer rival fleets. Piracy declined under centralized control. In some ways, Roman dominance created stability, but that stability came at the cost of plural balance. Carthage had offered an alternative pole of power. Its absence simplified the political map. History sometimes celebrates simplification, but diversity of power can foster creativity. 2 strong centers encourage adaptation. One dominant center encourages conformity. Carthage's fall reduced the Mediterranean to a single axis. That axis endured for centuries until Rome itself fragmented. And when Rome fragmented, new powers rose along familiar coasts, because geography invites recurrence. The same harbor that attracted Phoenician settlers attracted Roman colonists. Later, it attracted Vandals. Later still, Byzantines and Arabs. The coastline remembers opportunity. As twilight settles over our long reflection, consider this. Carthage's greatest strength was not its fleet, not its silver mines, not even Hannibal's tactical genius. It was its capacity to connect. Across cultures, across seas, across generations, connection built wealth. Connection built resilience. Connection built identity. But connection alone could not protect it from a rival determined to sever it, and so the city burned. Yet connection endures in memory, in scholarship, in rediscovered inscriptions, in archaeological maps of circular harbors. The forgotten city becomes remembered not through monuments towering above ground, but through patient excavation, through slow reconstruction, through willingness to question inherited narratives. We approach now the final stretch of this journey. The sea is calm again. The harbor, though altered, still curves in a familiar arc. The Byrsa hill still rises gently, and Carthage, though gone as a sovereign power, remains as a lesson carried forward. When you are ready, we will enter the final meditative closing, drawing the full arc together into one quiet horizon. There is a moment just after sunset when the Mediterranean turns almost silver. The wind softens, the water stills, the horizon blurs gently into fading light. If you were standing on the North African coast during that quiet hour more than 2,000 years ago, you would not have seen destiny written in the sky. You would not have known that this harbor, alive with ships and voices, would one day become a field of stone. You would not have known that a rival city across the sea was debating whether your world should continue to exist. History, while it unfolds, rarely feels dramatic. It feels ordinary. Carthage lived most of its life in that ordinariness, in ledgers carefully balanced, in contracts negotiated, in ships loaded and unloaded, in children learning the rhythms of trade and tide. War punctuated its history, yes, but trade defined it, resilience defined it, adaptation defined it. And when we step back from the flames of 146 BCE, from the spectacle of Hannibal crossing the Alps, from the rhetoric of Roman senators, we see something deeper. We see a civilization built on connection. Connection is quieter than conquest. It does not leave behind triumphal arches. It leaves behind roots. It leaves behind habits. It leaves behind patterns of exchange that persist even when names change. Carthage's destruction did not end Mediterranean commerce. It reshaped it under Roman control. But the logic of maritime networks, the understanding that sea lanes are arteries of prosperity, endured. The Romans learned that lesson well. After Carthage was gone, Rome expanded naval infrastructure. It secured shipping lanes. It protected grain routes from North Africa to Italy. In doing so, it institutionalized what Carthage had long practiced. The student absorbed the rival's methods. Yet Carthage's identity was more than economic. It was cultural continuity stretching back to the Levant. Phoenician seafarers had once followed stars across unfamiliar waters. They had established colonies not through mass conquest, but through negotiation and settlement. Carthage inherited that spirit. It became the western anchor of an eastern heritage, and when it fell, something of that lineage was broken. Not entirely erased, but interrupted. The Mediterranean lost one of its balancing centers. For centuries afterward, Rome dominated the Western Sea without equal competitor. Stability followed, expansion followed, imperial confidence followed. But power without balance changes character. It grows certain of itself. It forgets what it once feared. Carthage had once been that fear. The memory of Cannae haunted Rome for generations. The name Hannibal lingered like a warning. And perhaps that lingering fear fueled the final decision to erase the city completely. Fear is powerful. It preserves vigilance. It justifies aggression. It transforms rivals into existential threats. Carthage became more than a state in Roman imagination. It became a symbol. And symbols, once magnified, are difficult to tolerate. Yet symbols are also fragile. When we look at the ruins today, we do not see a monstrous enemy. We see foundations of homes, drainage channels, harbor outlines. We see evidence of human intention, of planning, of care. We see a city that thrived for centuries before it collided with Rome. The forgotten city of Carthage invites a quiet reconsideration of how we remember history. Why do some civilizations dominate textbooks while others survive in footnotes? Why do we inherit narratives shaped by victors without questioning what was lost? Carthage's absence from common memory is not proof of insignificance. It is proof of thorough destruction. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, still reconstructing its story, still tracing its trade routes, still debating its rituals, still imagining its harbor alive with ships at dawn. Perhaps that is the final irony. Rome sought to eliminate Carthage so completely that no rival would remain, and yet the very act of destruction immortalized it. The Punic Wars became central to Roman identity. Hannibal became a legend studied by generals for centuries. Carthage became the cautionary tale of what happens when rivalry becomes intolerable. In trying to silence Carthage, Rome ensured it would never entirely disappear. As darkness settles fully over the Mediterranean now, the sea remains steady. It has carried Phoenician sails, Roman fleets, Vandal ships, Byzantine squadrons, modern freighters. Empires pass across its surface, but the water remains indifferent. Carthage once mastered that water. Then it vanished from it. But in the quiet repetition of waves against shore, something of its story endures. We are nearing the final breath of this long journey. One more reflection remains, one more horizon to cross. And so we return to the beginning, not to flames, not to war, but to the shoreline. A small fleet arriving from the eastern Mediterranean nearly 3,000 years ago. Tired sailors scanning the coast, a hill rising gently above a natural harbor, a decision made to build, not knowing that centuries later the name of this place would echo through history as both rival and ruin. Carthage began as possibility. That is easy to forget. When we think of it now, we often think of Hannibal's elephants or Rome's vengeance. We think of siege and fire. But for most of its existence, Carthage was not a battlefield. It was a city waking at dawn. It was merchants discussing cargo weight and price. It was farmers inspecting soil and irrigation channels. It was shipbuilders shaping hulls with practiced hands. It was priests lighting incense as sunlight filtered into temples. It was ordinary life sustained across generations, 6 centuries of continuity, 6 centuries of adaptation, 6 centuries of learning how to survive in a world of shifting alliances and expanding powers. That longevity matters. Carthage was not a brief experiment. It was one of the great powers of the ancient Mediterranean. It mastered maritime logistics. It built one of the most sophisticated harbor systems of its age. It connected Iberian silver to North African grain to Levantine heritage. It produced a commander whose tactical brilliance is still studied today. And yet, it fell. Not because it lacked intelligence, not because it lacked resilience, but because it faced a rival whose vision of security left no room for coexistence. Rome chose finality, and when Rome chose finality, Carthage could not outadapt annihilation. The city burned, its people were enslaved, its political identity ended. But history is rarely as clean as destruction intends. Rome rebuilt on the same ground. It absorbed agricultural knowledge, it inherited trade patterns, it relied on the same fertile fields. Carthage, in altered form, continued shaping the Mediterranean long after its name was cursed in the Senate. And deeper still, beneath Roman streets and later ruins, the Punic foundations remained. Stone beneath stone, layer beneath layer, memory beneath narrative. The forgotten city is not forgotten because it was small. It is forgotten because it was silenced, its texts largely lost, its voice filtered through adversaries, its monuments dismantled. But archaeology has given it back dimension. Harbor outlines traced from the air, stelae rising quietly from the topet, residential grids revealing careful planning. Each fragment restores complexity. Each excavation softens propaganda. Each rediscovered inscription whispers that Carthage was more than Rome's enemy. It was a civilization in its own right, and perhaps that is the final lesson. History is not simply the story of who won, it is the story of who endured in memory. Rome endured in institutions, Carthage endured in influence. Rome left monuments towering above ground, Carthage left networks embedded beneath it. One shaped empire, the other shaped exchange, both shaped the Mediterranean. If you stand today on the coast near Tunis at sunrise, you can watch light spread across water that once held Carthaginian fleets. Fishing boats drift where warships once docked. The harbor curve remains recognizable even if altered. The sea does not mourn. It does not celebrate. It simply continues. Empires rise along its shores. Empires fall. New names replace old ones. But the patterns of human ambition, fear, resilience, and adaptation repeat. Carthage's story is not only ancient, it is timeless. It reminds us that prosperity can provoke suspicion, that rivalry can harden into obsession, that resilience can delay destruction, but not always prevent it, that geography can outlast ideology. And it reminds us that beneath every grand narrative of conquest lies a quieter narrative of daily life, of families and workers and children who never imagined their city would become a cautionary tale. As we close this long journey through the forgotten city of Carthage, let the final image be peaceful, not flames, not siege towers, but morning light over a calm Mediterranean, a harbor waking, a ship setting sail, a city alive in its moment, unaware of the centuries to come. Carthage ruled the sea. Carthage challenged Rome. Carthage fell. But Carthage remains, in memory, in influence, in the quiet persistence of history beneath the surface. And like the tide against the North African shore, its story continues to return, again and again, to those willing to listen.